It was one of those nights where everything felt just right. The kind of night that makes you want to step outside, breathe in the cool air, and let your mind wander. Jack had been looking forward to this moment all week. He'd finally moved into his new cabin, a cozy little place tucked away in the woods of a quiet neighborhood called Pine Ridge Estates. It wasn't much, but it was his escape from the chaos of his job as a federal agent. A place where he could relax, recharge, and forget about the world for a while. The cabin sat on a decent-sized lot, surrounded by tall pine trees that swayed gently in the breeze. Jack loved how peaceful it felt here. No honking cars, no crowds, no noise, just the sound of crickets chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. That night, he decided to take advantage of the calm. Around midnight, after finishing up some paperwork, he put on a hoodie and sweatpants, slipped his phone into his pocket, and stepped outside. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the property. Jack walked slowly, taking in the sights and sounds around him. He checked the fence line, making sure nothing looked out of place. Then he stopped by the shed to make sure the lock was secure. Everything seemed fine. As he strolled around, he couldn't help but smile. This was exactly what he needed, a break from the stress of his demanding career. But then, something caught his eye. A security camera mounted on a neighbor's tree was pointed directly at his cabin. Jack frowned. He hadn't noticed it earlier, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. The lens glinted faintly under the moonlight, and for a second, he wondered if it was even legal to have cameras aimed at someone else's property. Still, he shrugged it off. People got weird about privacy sometimes, especially in neighborhoods like this one. He figured whoever owned the camera was probably just being cautious. Little did Jack know, his casual walk was already causing trouble. Somewhere nearby, a woman sat glued to her laptop screen, watching live footage from that very same camera. She zoomed in on Jack, studying his every move. To her, he didn't look like a guy just enjoying a breath of fresh air. No, to her, he looked suspicious. Dangerous, even. Jack, completely unaware of the drama brewing behind closed doors, continued his stroll. He paused near the edge of his property, leaning against a tree to listen to the distant hoot of an owl. For a brief moment, he thought about grabbing a flashlight and heading deeper into the woods. But then he remembered it was late, and he didn't want to risk waking anyone or, worse, running into some wild animal. So instead, he turned back toward the cabin, ready to call it a night. What Jack didn't realize was that his simple decision to step outside had set off a chain reaction. Someone in the neighborhood was convinced he was up to no good. And soon enough, that suspicion would lead to a 911 call, flashing police lights, and a confrontation that neither Jack nor anyone else saw coming. Back in her dimly lit living room, the HOA president sat hunched over her laptop, eyes glued to the live feed from the security camera. She had installed the system herself, part of her mission to keep the neighborhood safe and orderly. Every corner of Pine Ridge Estates was under her watchful eye, or so she liked to think. And tonight, someone had caught her attention. The man on the screen was walking casually around his property, stopping occasionally to look at things. To anyone else, it might have seemed harmless, but not to her. In her mind, nothing was ever truly innocent. People who wandered around late at night were either up to no good or hiding something. That's just how the world worked, according to her. She zoomed in closer, trying to get a better look at the figure. He wasn't wearing anything unusual, just sweatpants and a hoodie, but that didn't ease her suspicions. If anything, it made them worse. Why would someone dress so casually while sneaking around? It didn't add up. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she replayed snippets of the footage, searching for clues. Was he checking windows? Testing locks? Scoping out houses? Her heart began to race. What if he was planning to break into one of the homes? Or worse, what if he was some kind of predator targeting families? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't let that happen. Not on her watch. This was her neighborhood, after all. She had spent years building it into a safe haven, and she wasn't about to let some stranger ruin everything. Without wasting another second, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her hands trembled slightly as she pressed the numbers, but her voice was firm when the dispatcher answered. "Hi, yes, I need to report a suspicious person," she said quickly, cutting straight to the point. "There's a man walking around outside, and he looks like he's casing the place. He's been pacing back and forth for a while now." The dispatcher asked for more details. "Can you describe him?" They said calmly, used to these kinds of calls. "He's tall, maybe in his 30s or 40s, she replied, squinting at the screen again. "Wearing dark clothes, a hoodie, and sweatpants. He's moving slowly, like he's trying not to draw attention, but trust me, it's suspicious. He's definitely up to something." The dispatcher assured her that officers would be dispatched to investigate, but that wasn't enough for her. She needed to take matters into her own hands. Hanging up the phone, she grabbed a flashlight and slipped on her sneakers. If the police weren't going to get here fast enough, then she'd confront the man herself. After all, it was her duty to protect the neighborhood. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face, and she hesitated for a moment. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. For a split second, doubt crept into her mind. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe the man really was just taking a walk. But then she shook her head, dismissing the thought. No, she knew better. You couldn't afford to be too careful these days. With determination driving her forward, she marched toward the edge of her property, shining the flashlight into the shadows. She scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. The man was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't discourage her. She kept moving, following the path she assumed he'd taken based on the camera footage. Each step felt heavier than the last, her nerves getting the best of her. But she refused to turn back. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to her, Jack had already started heading back inside. His peaceful stroll had come to an end, and he was ready to call it a night. He locked the door behind him, flicked on the lights, and flopped onto the couch with a sigh. It had been a long day, and the fresh air had done wonders for clearing his head. Little did he know, trouble was brewing just beyond his doorstep. Minutes later, the sound of sirens pierced through the silence. Red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as two police cruisers sped down the dirt road leading to his cabin. Jack froze, confused. What on earth was happening? Had there been an accident nearby? A fire? Or worse, was someone in trouble? He rushed to the window to see what was going on. That's when he spotted them, the police cars pulling up along the curb, followed by the unmistakable figure of the HOA president marching toward his front yard, flashlight in hand. Her expression was a mix of anger and triumph, like she'd just caught a burglar red-handed. Jack's stomach sank. Something told him this wasn't going to end well. The flashing lights of the police cruisers spilled across Jack's yard, breaking the stillness of the night like a thunderclap. He stood frozen for a moment, staring out the window in disbelief. What was going on? Why were the cops here? His mind raced as he tried to piece together what could possibly have brought them to his doorstep at this hour. Taking a deep breath, Jack forced himself to stay calm. Whatever this was, he knew panicking wouldn't help. He grabbed his phone just in case. He always kept it close when he was off duty, and slipped on his shoes before stepping outside. The cool night air hit him as he approached the officers, hands raised slightly in a gesture of cooperation. He didn't want anyone jumping to conclusions. Is there a problem? officers?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Before they could answer, the HOA president appeared, stomping toward them with her flashlight clenched tightly in one hand. Her face was flushed, her hair slightly disheveled from rushing through the woods. She pointed an accusatory finger at Jack, her voice sharp and cutting through the quiet night. "That's him," she declared, almost shouting. "He's been sneaking around people's houses all night. I saw him on the cameras walking back and forth, checking things out. He's definitely up to no good." Jack blinked, taken aback by the intensity of her words. Sneaking around? All he'd done was take a walk around his own property. How had that turned into some kind of criminal activity? One of the officers stepped forward, his expression neutral but alert. "Sir, can we see some ID, please?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. Jack nodded and reached into his pocket without hesitation. As he pulled out his wallet, he realized this was the moment where things could either go smoothly or spiral further out of control. He flipped open the leather case, revealing not only his driver's license but also his federal badge. The metallic glint of the badge caught the light, and for a brief second, there was silence. "I'm a federal agent," Jack said evenly, holding up the badge so the officers could get a better look. "I'm currently on leave, but I work with the Department of Homeland Security." The officers exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from suspicion to curiosity. One of them radioed in to verify Jack's credentials while the other continued to study him carefully. Jack could tell they weren't entirely convinced yet. They had a job to do, after all, but he could also sense their demeanor softening. Meanwhile, the HOA president wasn't ready to let go of her accusations. She crossed her arms over her chest, glaring at Jack like he was some sort of master manipulator trying to pull a fast one on everyone. "How do we even know that's real?" she snapped, her voice dripping with skepticism. "For all we know, you could have bought that badge online or something." Jack bit back a sigh. This woman clearly wasn't going to back down anytime soon. But instead of getting defensive, he decided to stay calm and professional. "You can check with dispatch," he told her, gesturing toward the officer who was already confirming his identity. "They'll verify everything." The HOA president huffed, clearly unhappy but unable to argue further. Still, she lingered nearby, watching intently as the officers spoke quietly into their radios. After a few tense minutes, the verification came through. Jack's badge was legitimate. He really was a federal agent. The officers visibly relaxed, their postures loosening as they processed the information. One of them turned to Jack and offered an apologetic smile. "Sorry for the trouble, sir," he said sincerely. "We appreciate your patience while we sorted this out." Jack nodded, understanding that they were just doing their jobs. "No problem," he replied. "Better safe than sorry, right?" But the HOA president wasn't satisfied. If anything, she looked even angrier now, like the confirmation of Jack's identity somehow made her feel foolish. "This doesn't prove anything," she insisted, her voice rising again. "Just because you say you're a federal agent doesn't mean you're not casing the neighborhood." At this point, Jack felt a mix of frustration and amusement bubbling inside him. On one hand, he couldn't believe how far this woman was willing to push her accusations. On the other hand, he found her stubbornness almost comical. Clearly, she wasn't used to being wrong or challenged. Realizing that arguing with her wasn't going to resolve anything, Jack suggested a different approach. "Why don't we all go inside?" he proposed, gesturing toward his cabin. "I'll make some coffee, and we can talk this through calmly." The officers exchanged another glance, then nodded in agreement. They were eager to wrap up the situation peacefully, especially since it was clear there was no actual threat. To everyone's surprise, The HOA president hesitated for a moment before reluctantly nodding as well. Whether it was out of sheer curiosity or a desire to save face, she followed them inside. Once they were seated in Jack's cozy living room, cups of steaming coffee in hand, the atmosphere began to shift. The tension in the air slowly eased as Jack explained who he was and what he did for a living. He shared a few stories from his time as a federal agent, carefully chosen ones that highlighted his dedication to protecting others without giving away sensitive details. As he spoke, the officers listened with growing respect. Even the HOA president seemed to soften, though she remained guarded. By the end of the conversation, it was clear that the misunderstanding had stemmed from a combination of fear, assumption, and perhaps a little too much enthusiasm for neighborhood surveillance. Still, Jack couldn't help but notice the irony of the situation. Here he was, a trained professional whose job was to keep people safe, being treated like a potential criminal simply because he'd gone for a late-night walk. It was frustrating, sure, but also a reminder of how easily misconceptions could escalate into something much bigger. By the time the officers left, apologizing once again for the disturbance, Jack felt drained but relieved. The HOA president lingered for a few more awkward moments before finally heading home, muttering under her breath about strange behavior. Jack watched her go, shaking his head with a mixture of exasperation and amusement. It had been a long, bizarre night, but at least it was over. Or so, he thought. The coffee had done its job warming everyone up, both literally and figuratively. The tension in Jack's living room wasn't completely gone, but it had softened enough for people to start talking like human beings instead of adversaries. The officers sat on the couch, sipping their mugs and occasionally nodding as Jack spoke. Even the HOA president, still clutching her flashlight like it was a lifeline, seemed to relax just a little. She hadn't uncrossed her arms yet, though, which told Jack she wasn't ready to let go of her suspicions entirely. Jack leaned back in his chair, trying to strike a balance between being professional and approachable. He knew this woman wasn't going to budge unless he gave her something tangible to work with. So, he decided to share more about himself, not because he owed her an explanation, but because he wanted to clear the air once and for all. "I've been working in law enforcement for over 15 years, Jack began, keeping his tone conversational. "My job is to protect people, not cause trouble. That's why I bought this cabin, to get away from the chaos of the city and have a place where I can unwind. Trust me, if I wanted to scope out houses or do anything shady, I wouldn't be doing it here." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I understand why you might have been concerned. Late-night walks aren't exactly common, especially in a neighborhood like this. But I promise you, there's nothing suspicious about what I was doing. I was just enjoying some fresh air after a long day." The officers nodded along, clearly satisfied with his explanation. One of them even chuckled softly and said, "Honestly, sir, we've seen crazier things than someone taking a walk at night. We're glad this turned out to be nothing serious." But the HOA president wasn't laughing. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat. It was obvious she didn't want to admit she'd made a mistake. Instead, she countered with, "Well, how was I supposed to know that? You could have been anyone?" Jack sighed inwardly. This was always the tricky part, the moment when pride clashed with reason. He could tell she was struggling to reconcile her initial judgment with the reality sitting in front of her. Rather than argue, he chose empathy. "You're right," he said gently. "You didn't know who I was, and it's good that you care about the safety of this neighborhood. That's important. But maybe next time, before calling 911, you could try knocking on someone's door or asking questions first. Sometimes, a little communication can prevent a lot of unnecessary stress for everyone involved." His words hung in the air for A moment. The HOA president blinked, caught off guard by his calm response. For the first time since arriving at his cabin, she looked unsure of herself. Maybe it was the exhaustion setting in, or maybe it was the realization that her actions had caused a scene far bigger than necessary. Whatever it was, her shoulders dropped slightly, and she muttered, "I guess I just got carried away." Jack offered her a small, understanding smile. "It happens to all of us," he said. "No harm done, okay? Let's just move forward and make sure this doesn't happen again." The officers exchanged relieved glances. They were eager to wrap things up and leave the awkwardness behind. After exchanging a few final pleasantries, they stood up, thanked Jack for his patience, and headed toward the door. As they stepped outside, one of them turned back and gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Take care, sir, and sorry again for the mix-up." Once the officers were gone, Jack turned his attention back to the HOA president, who was still lingering awkwardly near the doorway. She fiddled with the strap of her flashlight, avoiding eye contact. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she cleared her throat and said, "Look, I'm sorry for disturbing your night. I thought I was doing the right thing." Her apology came out stiff and reluctant, but Jack appreciated the effort. "Thank you," he replied sincerely. "And I appreciate that you care about keeping this neighborhood safe. Just remember, sometimes things aren't always what they seem." She nodded slowly, then turned to leave without another word. As she disappeared into the darkness, Jack closed the door behind her and let out a long breath. He leaned against the wall for a moment, replaying the events of the night in his head. It had been surreal, to say the least. Who would have thought a simple walk around his property would lead to such a bizarre chain of events? ###**** word. Travels fast **** by morning, news of the incident had spread throughout Pine Ridge Estates like wildfire. Neighbors whispered about it over their morning coffee, speculating about what had happened. Some sided with the HOA president, praising her for being vigilant. Others criticized her for overreacting and involving the police unnecessarily. Opinions were divided, but one thing was certain. Everyone had an opinion. Jack, however, stayed out of it. He didn't feel the need to defend himself or fuel the gossip mill. Instead, he focused on enjoying his weekend retreat, taking advantage of the peaceful surroundings while he still could. Still, he couldn't help but notice subtle changes in the neighborhood dynamic. For starters, the HOA president seemed to tone down her usual antics. She was less quick to send out emails complaining about minor rule violations, and she stopped showing up unannounced to inspect people's yards. Whether it was guilt or a newfound sense of restraint, Jack wasn't sure. Either way, it made life a little quieter for everyone. Other neighbors, meanwhile, greeted him with knowing smiles whenever they saw him. A few even joked about the spy cam incident, teasing him good-naturedly about his late-night stroll turning into a neighborhood spectacle. Jack laughed it off, happy to see that most people weren't holding any grudges, but the experience left a lasting impression on him. It reminded him of how quickly assumptions could spiral out of control and how important it was to approach situations with an open mind. In his line of work, jumping to conclusions could mean the difference between life and death. Out here, in the suburbs, it might mean a middle-of-the-night visit from the cops. ### Lessons learned as the days passed. Life in Pine Ridge Estates returned to its usual rhythm. Kids played outside, dogs barked in the distance, and the hum of lawnmowers filled the air on sunny afternoons. Things were mostly back to normal, or as normal as they ever were in a community like this one. For Jack, the whole ordeal became a funny story to tell his colleagues when he returned to work. They laughed at the irony of a federal agent being mistaken for a burglar, and some even joked that he should have flashed his badge sooner to avoid the drama altogether. But beneath the humor, there was a deeper lesson, a reminder that trust, communication, and understanding were essential, no matter where you lived. As for the HOA president, she never brought up the incident again. But every now and then, when Jack passed her in the driveway or at the mailbox, she'd give him a polite nod. It wasn't much, but it was progress. And in a neighborhood like Pine Ridge Estates, progress, even in small doses, was worth celebrating. Jack smiled to himself as he locked up his cabin and headed back to the city. Despite everything that had happened, he felt grateful for the experience. It had taught him a valuable lesson about human nature and reinforced his belief that sometimes a little patience and kindness could go a long way. By the time the weekend rolled around, the buzz about the late-night spy cam incident had reached every corner of Pine Ridge Estates. Neighbors who hadn't even been there that night were swapping stories like it was some kind of neighborhood legend. Some versions exaggerated the details, like how the HOA president supposedly chased Jack through the woods with a flashlight and a baseball bat, which never happened. Others added their own flair, claiming Jack had pulled out his badge mid-confrontation like a scene from an action movie, also not true. Despite the embellishments, one thing was clear: the story had become a talking point for everyone in the community. At the local coffee shop, people huddled in groups, whispering conspiratorially. On social media, posts popped up with vague hints about recent events, accompanied by memes poking fun at overzealous neighborhood watch members. It was the kind of drama that small communities thrived on, but it also brought out different sides of people. For Jack, the attention was both amusing and slightly overwhelming. He wasn't used to being the center of gossip, not in a place where he'd hoped to blend into the background. But instead of letting it bother him, he decided to embrace it. After all, life was too short to stress over things he couldn't control. So when neighbors waved or called out friendly jokes as he walked by, he responded with a grin and a laugh. If anything, the whole situation made him feel more connected to the community, even if it was under unusual circumstances. The ripple effect. As the days went by, the incident started to have a ripple effect on the neighborhood. For starters, the HOA president became noticeably quieter. She still attended meetings and sent out emails, but her tone softened. Gone were the sharp criticisms about minor infractions like lawn decorations or mailbox colors. Instead, she focused on practical issues, fixing potholes, organizing trash, pickup schedules, and planning community events. It was almost as if the confrontation with Jack had forced her to reflect on her priorities. Other residents began to follow suit. Conversation shifted from complaints about rules to discussions about improving the neighborhood. Someone suggested starting a book club, while another proposed hosting a monthly potluck dinner. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere changed. People seemed to be making an effort to connect with each other rather than nitpick every little detail. Jack noticed these subtle shifts during his walks around the property. Neighbors who had once barely acknowledged him now greeted him warmly. One elderly couple even invited him over for tea, eager to hear his side of the story. They listened intently as he recounted the events of that night, occasionally laughing at the absurdity of it all. By the end of the visit, they thanked him for sharing his experience, saying it gave them a fresh perspective on how misunderstandings could escalate so quickly. A new perspective for the HOA president. The aftermath of the incident was a turning point. While she never publicly admitted fault, it was clear that the experience had left its mark. She stopped obsessing over security footage and spent less time monitoring every move her neighbors made. Whether this change came from guilt, embarrassment, or simply a desire to avoid further conflict, no one knew for sure. What mattered was that she seemed to be loosening her grip, a small victory for everyone involved. One evening, as Jack sat on his porch watching the sunset, he spotted her walking down the street. She paused near his driveway, hesitating as if unsure whether to approach. Finally, she mustered the courage to wave awkwardly. Jack returned the gesture with a polite nod, signaling that there were no hard feelings between them. She smiled faintly before continuing on her way, but the brief exchange felt like progress. It struck Jack then how much humans crave closure, even in situations where blame wasn't entirely clear-cut. The HOA president likely felt torn between her need to protect the neighborhood and the knowledge that her actions had caused unnecessary trouble. He imagined she replayed that night in her head just as often as he did, questioning what she could have done differently. And maybe that self-reflection was exactly what she needed to grow, not just as a leader, but as a person. Finding balance over time, the novelty of the incident wore off, and life in Pine Ridge Estates settled back into its usual rhythm. Kids played outside until dusk, dogs barked at squirrels, and the occasional car alarm echoed through the streets. Things weren't perfect, no neighborhood ever was, but they were better than before. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface had eased, replaced by a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect. Jack found himself appreciating the little moments more, the sound of laughter drifting from nearby yards, the smell of someone's barbecue wafting through the air, the sight of fireflies dancing in the twilight. These were the things that made living here worthwhile, despite the quirks and challenges. Still, he couldn't help but chuckle whenever he thought about that night. Who would have guessed that a federal agent taking a walk around his cabin would spark such chaos? It was a reminder of how unpredictable life could be, and how sometimes the most mundane actions could lead to extraordinary outcomes. To ensure nothing like this happened again, Jack made a mental note to keep his badge handy whenever he ventured outside after dark. Not because he expected trouble, but because he knew how quickly assumptions could spiral out of control. In a world where trust was often in short supply, having proof of your identity could save you a lot of headaches. Moving forward as the weeks turned into months, Jack grew more comfortable in his new home. He joined a few neighborhood committees, lending his expertise to safety initiatives without coming across as overbearing. His presence brought a sense of reassurance to the community, especially since people now knew he had real-world experience dealing with high-pressure situations. The HOA president, for her part, continued to mellow out. She even organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss ways to improve communication and prevent similar incidents in the future. During the discussion, she admitted, albeit indirectly, that jumping to conclusions wasn't always helpful. While she didn't single anyone out, it was clear she was referring to the night she'd called 911 on Jack. The admission earned her nods of approval from the crowd, signaling that forgiveness was possible when people showed genuine effort to change. For Jack, the entire experience reinforced something he already knew. Human connection was built on trust, empathy, and understanding. Sure, mistakes would happen along the way, misunderstandings were inevitable, but it was how you handled them that truly mattered. By choosing patience over anger, humor over frustration, and openness over defensiveness, even the most awkward encounters could lead to growth for individuals and communities alike. The final takeaway looking back. Jack realized the incident had taught him a valuable lesson about human nature. People weren't always rational, and fear often drove them to act in ways they later regretted. But beneath the surface, everyone shared the same basic desires to feel safe, understood, and valued. Whether you lived in a bustling city or a quiet suburban enclave, those universal truths remained constant. As he locked up his cabin one last time before heading back to work, Jack felt a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the quirky personalities that made Pine Ridge Estates unique. Gratitude for the lessons learned during a wild, unforgettable weekend. And gratitude for the reminder that sometimes the simplest acts, like taking a walk under the stars, could leave the biggest impact.